The first trickle of water began as a whisper, a sly chuckle through the spillway gates that quickly grew into a roaring declaration of war. Where are you watching from? I like to know. Drop your city in the comments. 35 unsold McMansions stood gleaming in the morning sun, their perfect white facades and manicured lawns about to become lakefront property whether they wanted to or not. I watched from the hilltop, my hand still resting on the cold brass control wheel, the scent of wet earth and justice thick in the air. They thought a deployed soldier was an easy target. That paperwork and petty bureaucracy was stronger than water rights and gravity. They built their suburban paradise on stolen land, on my grandfather's legacy, while I was overseas fighting for the very country that let them steal it. But they forgot one thing. Water always remembers its path, and I remembered how to open the gates. By the time the first sirens wailed in the distance, their foundations were already singing with the pressure, and I was just the man who knew how to listen to the song. The land had been in my family since 1932, when my great-grandfather William McCoy used his life savings to buy 47 acres of prime Texas hill country just outside what would eventually become Austin's suburban sprawl. He wasn't a wealthy man, just a stubborn Scots-Irish farmer who believed in the permanence of dirt and the promise of water. The centerpiece of his acquisition wasn't the rolling pastures or the ancient life, oaks, but the spring-fed creek that cut through the property's lowest valley. That creek became our family's lifeblood, watering cattle through drought years and creating a small ecosystem that sustained everything from white-tailed deer to migratory birds. In 1958, my grandfather built the dam, a simple but elegant earthen structure reinforced with local limestone that created a 7-acre reservoir. He worked with Army Corps engineers to design it properly, making sure the spillways could handle 100-year floods. He called it the insurance policy against drought, against hard times, against whatever the Texas weather might throw at us. I grew up on that land, learning to fish in that reservoir, climbing those oaks, and understanding the rhythm of the seasons through the rise and fall of the water. The scent of bluebonnets in spring, the taste of dust in August, the sound of cicadas humming in the heat. These were the sensory markers of my childhood. After high school, I joined the Army and eventually found my calling in the Corps of Engineers, specializing in water infrastructure and flood control. I did 2 tours in Afghanistan, helping villages build irrigation systems and manage water resources in a place where every drop was fought over. While I was overseas, my grandfather passed, leaving the land to me with one specific instruction. In his will, protect the water, everything else is secondary. My sister Sarah, a graphic designer in California, handled the estate paperwork through a local management company. The taxes got paid, the fences stayed up, but nobody was watching. The water. Nobody was watching the HOA that had formed in the new development next door. Willow Creek Estate started as 20 homes on the other side of the creek, but it had ambitions. Margaret Maggie Thornwell, the HOA president, was the kind of woman who used Southern charm like a weapon. Her husband Richard sat on the city council, and together they formed a perfect nexus of petty authority and political influence. She drove a white Lexus SUV that always seemed freshly washed, and her perfume, something floral and expensive, could be detected from 20 feet away. The development she presided over was a study in suburban perfection. Identical mailboxes, chemically enhanced lawns, and restrictive covenants that governed everything from paint colors to patio furniture. It was a world of appearance over substance, and my family's working ranch stood in stark contrast to their manufactured paradise. When I returned from my final deployment, I expected to find the same land I'd left. The familiar gravel road, the old farmhouse, the dam holding strong. But as I turned off the county highway, the first thing I noticed was the sound. Not the quiet hum of nature I remembered, but the relentless grind of construction equipment. The air tasted of diesel exhaust and disturbed earth. And then I saw them, dozens of foundation forms stretching across what should have been our back pasture. They weren't just near my property line, they were on it. They were through it. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday, the thick ivory paper feeling alien and hostile among the usual bills and catalogs. The return address bore the official seal of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, and the envelope had that particular weight that only bad news carries. Inside, on letterhead that looked more appropriate for a corporate law firm than a neighborhood association, was a notice of violation, not for my property, for theirs. According to the document, my neglected and dangerous dam structure posed an imminent threat to their new development, and I was ordered to immediately dismantle it at my own expense. The language was cold, legalistic, and utterly confident. Attached was a second document, a survey map that showed my property lines magically redrawn, placing the dam and half the reservoir inside their boundaries. My hands actually trembled as I read it a second time, then a third. The sheer audacity took my breath away. They weren't just claiming my land, they were claiming my water. I drove straight to the county courthouse, the letter burning a hole in my passenger seat. The clerk in the records department remembered my grandfather fondly, but grew increasingly uncomfortable as she pulled the files. There's been some rezoning, she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. Emergency measures after the last flood season. She showed me the documents. While I was deployed, the city council had used emergency powers to redesignate our agricultural land as residential overflow, citing floodplain management. Richard Thornwell had championed the measure. The next stop was the HOA office, a beautifully restored Victorian house that served as ground zero for Maggie's empire. She received me in a sun-drenched office that smelled of lemon polish and ambition. She wore a tennis outfit despite it being Wednesday morning, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Captain McCoy," she said, gesturing to a chair that was slightly too low. "We've been hoping you'd come by. That dam of yours is quite the concern." She spoke about safety, about community, about property values, all the coded language of exclusion and control. When I showed her my grandfather's deed, she waved a dismissive hand. "Those old documents are so romantic, but we live in the modern world. With the adverse possession claim and the rezoning, I'm afraid that dam is now our problem." The term adverse possession hit me like a physical blow. It's an ancient legal doctrine that allows someone to claim ownership of land they've used openly for a certain period. They've been using my land while I was gone, running utilities across it, accessing the reservoir, even building a temporary road for their construction equipment. And they documented every moment. As I left her office, stunned and furious, I saw my neighbor, Mr. Henderson from the adjacent farm, standing by his truck, his face grim. "They got you too," he said, not a question. "They tried to take my well water last year. Cost me $30,000 in legal fees to stop them." That's when I noticed the construction crews weren't just building near the creek, they were in it. Backhoes were digging a new channel, diverting the spring-fed stream that supplied my reservoir into a concrete culvert that ran toward their development. The water that had flowed naturally for centuries was being stolen in broad daylight, and nobody seemed to care. The bureaucratic siege began quietly, almost politely. A building inspector showed up first, citing code violations on structures that had stood unchanged for 50 years. Then the health department arrived, concerned about water contamination from our livestock, though we'd never had a single issue. The fire marshal followed, demanding we create new access roads that just happened to cross through the HOA's newly claimed territory. Each visit required time, documentation, and increasingly expensive repairs for violations that felt invented rather than real. Meanwhile, the water diversion continued. Each morning I walked to the dam and measured the dropping water level with a stone marker I'd carved as a boy. The reservoir, once vibrant and full of life, was becoming a stagnant pond. The fish were dying, their white bellies turning up in the warming water. The birds that had nested along the banks for generations were gone. The air smelled wrong. Less of water in life, more of mud and decay. Maggie Thornwell escalated her campaign with surgical precision. She organized neighborhood safety meetings where my property was discussed as a threat. She never used my name, just phrases like the neglected upstream property and the dangerous structure. Her husband used his city council position to fast-track permits for their continued construction while slowing down every one of my applications. I hired a lawyer, a sharp environmental attorney named Amanda Cruz, but even she was frustrated by the wall of bureaucratic resistance. "It's like trying to fight smoke," she told me after another pointless hearing. "Oh, they're not breaking any single law dramatically, they're bending a dozen little ones simultaneously." The personal attacks began subtly too. My service record, once a source of community pride, was suddenly being discussed as a potential Liability. Anonymous posts on local forums wondered aloud about PTSD and instability. I started noticing cars parked at the end of my driveway at odd hours, taking photographs. When confronted, they claimed to be bird watchers or nature enthusiasts, but their expensive cameras and clean shoes told a different story. The final straw came when I found survey markers driven into my grandfather's gravesite, a small family plot under an ancient oak where 4 generations of McCoys rested. They were planning to pave over my history, literally. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch with my grandfather's journals, reading his careful handwriting about water flows and rainfall patterns. And I found something, a passing reference, to a 1910 compact with downstream farmers. It was vague, but it was a thread. And sometimes threads are all you have when everything else is being taken away. The next morning, I went back to the courthouse basement, determined to follow that thread wherever it led. The old archivist remembered me and quietly pointed me toward a section of records that nobody much looks at anymore. Dust rose in clouds as I pulled the first ledger from the shelf. And that's when I found it. Not just the answer, but the weapon. The ledger was bound in cracked leather, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. It contained the minutes of the county water board, meetings from 1908 to 1915, dry bureaucratic language that mostly concerned irrigation disputes between farmers. But on page 143, dated June 12, 1910, I found a reference my grandfather had mentioned. The McCoy Compact wasn't just a gentleman's agreement, it was a formally recorded water sharing arrangement that gave our family senior rights to the spring and the creek in perpetuity. The compact had been signed after a drought year when my great-grandfather had shared water with downstream farms, saving their crops. In gratitude, they'd formalized what became known as first water rights. Our claim took precedence over all others forever, but the real discovery came 3 pages later. Attached as an exhibit was a survey map from 1912 that showed the original creek bed running directly through what was now the heart of the HOA development. Their water features and seasonal streams were actually our diverted waterway. They hadn't just stolen the land, they'd stolen the river itself. I practically ran to the modern zoning office, the ancient documents clutched in my hands. The current zoning map showed the creek's historical path as a proposed greenbelt that had been relocated due to development constraints. The paperwork was slick, professional, and completely fraudulent. Someone had altered historical documents to justify stealing a waterway. Amanda, my lawyer, met me at the courthouse, her eyes widening as she saw the documents. "This isn't just a property dispute anymore," she whispered, careful not to be overheard. "This is federal. Altering navigable waterway documents violates 6 environmental laws." We spent the next week deep in research, uncovering layer upon layer of deception. The emergency rezoning had been based on falsified flood risk assessments. The environmental impact studies had been ghostwritten by a firm owned by Richard Thornwell's cousin. Even the adverse possession claim relied on fraudulent affidavits from witnesses who turned out to be HOA board members. But the most damning discovery came from the State Water Board. The HOA had applied for permanent water rights to the diverted creek, claiming it was a newly discovered seasonal feature. Their application contained photographs of our spring, our water, presented as their own discovery. They weren't just stealing, they were documenting their theft in official paperwork. I stood at the dam that evening, watching the water continue to drop, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about negotiation anymore. This was about restoration. The law was on my side, but the system was on theirs. So I decided to use a force older than law, older than courts, older than any corrupt HOA board. I decided to use the water itself. The first step was simple. I closed the diversion gate they'd installed. The sound of water suddenly returning to its natural bed was like hearing a familiar song after years of silence. Within hours, Maggie Thornwell was at my gate, her perfect composure finally cracked. "What have you done?" she demanded, her voice shaking with something that wasn't quite anger. It was fear. "I've given the water back its memory," I told her, "and I was just getting started. If you were in my shoes, would you have reclaimed the water directly or pursued only legal channels? Tell me why in the comments below." The retaliation was swift and brutal. Within hours of closing their illegal diversion, I was served with an emergency restraining order citing endangerment of human life and property. Judge Henry Walsh, a golf partner of Richard Thornwell's, signed it without a hearing. Sheriff's deputies arrived to physically reopen the diversion channel, their faces grim with embarrassment. "Sorry, Jake," one muttered, "orders from above." But forcing the water back their way created an unexpected problem for them. The diverted flow now flooded their own construction site, something their hastily built channels couldn't handle. As their half-built foundations filled with muddy water, Maggie made her masterstroke move. She called a press conference, standing in front of the flooding site with a dozen concerned homeowners. "We're victims of water terrorism," she told. The cameras, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "While I was serving my country, this individual learned to use water as a weapon. Now he's turning that training against his own community." The footage ran on every local news channel, always with the same dramatic caption, "Veteran versus neighborhood." The online comments were brutal. That's when Amanda discovered the insurance angle. While everyone was distracted by the media circus, she dug into the HOA's financial filings. The development was insured through a specialty carrier that required specific flood mitigation measures. Measures that included permanent diversion of our creek. But here's where it got criminal. Their insurance applications claimed the diversion was complete and permanent with all necessary permits. They'd committed fraud to get coverage, and now my actions were revealing that fraud. Meanwhile, I found my grandfather's original dam construction permits from 1958 and discovered something extraordinary. Because he'd worked with the Army Corps of Engineers, the dam fell under federal jurisdiction, not local control. The HOA's entire claim to regulate or dismantle it was invalid. I scheduled a meeting with a Corps representative, a serious-faced engineer named Williams, who listened carefully to my story while examining the documents. "They did what?" he kept saying, his professional composure cracking. "They can't do that." But the real twist came from an unexpected source, Mr. Henderson, my neighbor who'd warned me initially. He brought over a box of old documents his father had kept, including letters between his family and mine about water sharing. And in that box, we found a photograph from 1963 showing the creek at flood stage, water flowing exactly where the HOA had built their most expensive homes. They hadn't just built on my land. They'd built in a floodplain and covered it up. Amanda immediately filed emergency motions with every regulatory agency she could think of. EPA, FEMA, Army Corps, State Environmental Protection. The paperwork alone would have buried a normal person, but she was relentless. "They're not just corrupt," she told me, her eyes blazing with something like joy. "They're stupid. They left a paper trail a mile wide." The HOA responded by escalating their harassment. They hired private security to patrol my property line. They filed complaints with Veteran Affairs about my mental state. They even convinced the local utility to threaten disconnection over unauthorized water manipulation. But with each attack, we discovered more evidence. Their desperation was making them sloppy. The dam became the physical embodiment of the struggle. The water level rising and falling with each legal maneuver, each bureaucratic battle. And through it all, I kept reading my grandfather's journals, learning more about why he built it, what it meant to him. It wasn't about control or power. It was about balance, and I was about to restore that balance in a way nobody expected. The second phase of their attack was more sophisticated, more personal. They went after my support network. Amanda received anonymous complaints to the State Bar Association. Mr. Henderson got hit with code violations on his farm that had stood for decades. Even the courthouse archivist who'd helped me found herself transferred to a different department. They were isolating me, cutting away my allies one by one. The private security patrols became more aggressive, their vehicles often stalling. Near my gates, their cameras always pointed at my house. I started finding cut fences, open gates, small vandalisms designed to look like accidents. The message was clear: stop fighting or things will get worse. The water war escalated too. They installed pumps to pull more water from the creek, trying to bypass the dam entirely. I responded by documenting every violation, every environmental law they broke. The data became my weapon. Flow rates, water quality tests, photographic evidence of the damage they were causing. I reached out to downstream farmers who'd been affected by the water theft, building a coalition of a willing. Mrs. Gable, whose organic farm was withering without the creek water. The Martinez family, who'd fished the creek for 3 generations. Even some homeowners within the HOA itself who were beginning to question Maggie's leadership. The legal battles became a dizzying whirl of motions and counter-motions. Amanda fought like a warrior, but the system was designed to favor those with money and connections. We won some small victories, a stay here, an injunction there, but the overall tide was still moving against us. Then came the night everything changed. I was checking the dam around 2 a.m., something I'd started doing regularly, when I found 2 men in black clothing attempting to sabotage the spillway mechanism. They weren't amateurs, they had specialized tools and knew exactly what they were doing. I didn't confront them, just recorded everything with my night vision camera and called the sheriff. But by the time deputies arrived, the men were gone, leaving behind only footprints in the mud. The attempted sabotage changed the game. This wasn't bureaucracy anymore. This was warfare. I installed my own security system, motion sensors, cameras. I started sleeping with my grandfather's old rifle by the door. The stress began to wear on me, the constant vigilance, the feeling of being under siege on my own land. The lowest point came when I received a letter from Veteran Services requesting a wellness check based on concerns from the community. The social worker who arrived was kind but thorough, asking questions about PTSD, about adjustment difficulties, about whether I felt angry or unstable. I realized they were building a narrative, not just to take my land, but to discredit me completely. That night, I almost gave up. Have you ever been pushed to the edge and found something that pulled you back? Share your story in the comments. The weight of it all felt unbearable, but then I found my grandfather's journal from the year he built. The dam. On the last page he'd written, "Sometimes the land fights back through us with just the hands." I knew then what I had to do. I wouldn't fight their way, with lawyers and paperwork and lies. I would fight the way water fights, with patience, with persistence, with the inevitable force of truth. I would open the dam. Not to flood or destroy, but to remember, to show the water its old path, to let nature testify on my behalf. The forecast called for heavy rains in 72 hours. Perfect. The rain began as a soft patter on the roof, then built to a steady drumbeat that echoed through the quiet house. I sat at my grandfather's old desk, spreading out the final pieces of evidence we'd uncovered. They weren't just stealing land or water. They were running a sophisticated real estate fraud scheme that stretched back years. Amanda had connected with an investigative reporter from the state capitol, and together they traced a pattern of similar land grabs across 3 counties. Richard Thornwell wasn't just a corrupt city councilman. He was the front man for a development group that specialized in adverse possession claims against vulnerable landowners, elderly owners, absentee heirs, and now deployed military personnel. Their method was always the same: identify valuable land with water rights, use political connections to rezone, fabricate adverse possession claims, then develop and flip the properties for massive profits. The water diversion was their signature move. Steal the water, claim the land was improved, then sell it as waterfront or water access property. My case was just the latest in a long pattern. But the real revelation came from the Army Corps engineer, Williams. He dug deeper into their permits and found something astonishing. The HOA had never applied for federal permission to alter a navigable waterway. Their entire development was illegal under the Clean Water Act. Worse, they'd known it. Internal. Emails showed Maggie discussing the risk of federal involvement and deciding to move fast and beg forgiveness later. Meanwhile, the attempted sabotage had yielded its own evidence. The tools left behind at the dam were traced to a security firm owned by Richard's brother. The sheriff, initially reluctant to get involved, now had no choice. There was too much evidence. But the most personal discovery came from my own property. While inspecting the dam after the sabotage attempt, I found something the would-be saboteurs had missed: a geological survey marker from 1910 buried deep near the foundation. It confirmed the original creek bed beyond any doubt, and it had my great-grandfather's initials carved faintly on one side. As the rain intensified, I realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about my land anymore. It was about every landowner they'd bullied, every law they'd bent, every system they'd corrupted, the water collecting in the reservoir. Wasn't just water, it was evidence, and it was about to give its testimony. I called Amanda, my voice steady despite the storm. "It's time," I said. "Notify everyone." She knew what I meant. We had a list: regulatory agencies, news organizations, environmental groups, everyone who needed to witness what happened next. Then I put on my grandfather's old raincoat and walked out into the storm. The dam waited, solid and patient as it had been for 60 years. The spillway controls were cold under my hands. Could feel the water pressing against the gates, eager to remember its path. In the distance, lightning flashed over the HOA's perfect houses. Their lights were going out one by one. Probably a weather-related outage. Perfect. They wouldn't see it coming. They thought they controlled everything. The water, the land, the law. But they'd forgotten the first rule of engineering. Water always wins. Always. The control room was exactly as my grandfather had left it. A small stone structure built into the dam itself, smelling of damp limestone and machine oil. The spillway. Controls were original equipment, massive brass wheels that turned with satisfying resistance, like opening a bank vault from a more substantial era. I'd spent the week preparing, maintaining mechanisms that hadn't been used in decades, clearing debris from the channels, documenting everything with photographs and video. This wasn't sabotage. It was restoration, legal restoration. The rain continued its relentless percussion on the stone roof as I made final preparations. Outside, the reservoir had reached capacity, water lapping at the emergency spillway for the first time in 20 years. The sound was a deep, thrumming vibration. You felt more than heard. The sound of potential energy waiting to become kinetic. Amanda had done her part brilliantly. Federal EPA investigators were stationed downstream, ready to document the water's return to its historical path. News crews, tipped off anonymously, were positioned at various points along the creek bed. Even some curious homeowners from the HOA had gathered, drawn by the strange activity and the building storm. Maggie Thornwell was nowhere to be seen, but I knew she was watching. Probably from her perfect living room, probably with a perfect glass of wine, probably still believing she could control this. She'd called twice that evening, first threatening, then offering a settlement so generous it would have set me up. For life, I declined both calls. There was no negotiating with gravity. At exactly 8:00 p.m., as the storm reached its peak intensity, I began the sequence. First, the auxiliary spillway, a gentle release to test the mechanisms. The sound was magnificent, a deep-throated roar that echoed through the valley. Water surged through the ancient stone channel, clean and powerful, following the path it had carved over centuries. Downstream, I knew, people were watching in awe as the dry creek bed suddenly came alive. The HOA's decorative bridges, built for show, not function, were already struggling with the flow. Their concrete-lined water features were overflowing, not designed for actual water volume. I monitored the gauges carefully, increasing flow incrementally. This wasn't about destruction. It was about demonstration. Demonstrating that the water knew its path. Demonstrating that their development had been built where water naturally flows. Demonstrating that some things can be controlled by paperwork. Or corruption. Then the lights went out. Not just in my control room, but throughout the valley. The backup generator kicked in, casting everything in emergency lighting's harsh glow. They'd cut the power. Of course they had. But my grandfather had anticipated this. The critical controls have mechanical backups. As I switched to manual operation, I heard vehicles approaching through the storm. Not sheriff's deputies. Private. Security trucks, their light bars cutting through the rain. Maggie had made her move. But so had I. As the first truck skidded to a stop outside, federal vehicles emerged from side roads. EPA enforcement, Army Corps police, even state rangers. They surrounded the security detail, detaining them without drama. The law had finally arrived. Through the rain-streaked windows, I saw Maggie get out of her Lexus without an umbrella, her perfect hair plastered to her head. She was screaming something, but the storm and the roaring water swallowed her words. She pointed at the control room. At me, her gestures sharp and frantic. But the federal officers simply guided her away toward their vehicles. The water was doing its work now, flowing exactly as nature intended, exactly as the historical documents showed it should. Their illegally built foundations were beginning to flood, not because I was flooding them, but because they built where water naturally goes. The justice was so perfect, it felt almost poetic. I opened the main spillway to full capacity. The dam shuddered gently, not with strain, but with purpose. A great beast awakening from long sleep. Below, the valley was coming alive with the sound of returning memory. And I was just the keeper of the gates. The water didn't destroy. It remembered. It flowed through the HOA development with the inexorable certainty of time itself, finding every low point, every natural channel, every place it had flowed for millennia before concrete and corruption tried to tell it otherwise. Their decorative ponds became part of the main channel. Their dry creek beds became actual creeks. Their waterfront properties became actually waterfront, whether they wanted to be or not. From my vantage point, I watched the transformation unfold in the storm's intermittent lightning flashes. It wasn't the violent deluge Maggie had predicted in her press conferences. It was a steady, powerful resurgence that looked less like disaster and more like nature correcting a mistake. The federal investigators were everywhere, measuring flows, taking samples, documenting everything. The news cameras captured it all. The water restoring its ancient path, the HOA's inadequate drainage systems failing, the surprised faces of residents watching from their windows. Most revealing was what didn't happen. No homes were damaged. No lives endangered. No real destruction occurred. The water was doing exactly what my grandfather's dam was designed to let it do: manage overflow in a controlled, natural way. The real flood was happening in the courthouse, where Amanda was simultaneously presenting our evidence to a federal judge. With the water actively demonstrating the historical flow patterns, the fraudulent documents became laughably obvious. The judge issued emergency orders halting all construction, freezing HOA assets, and appointing a federal receiver to manage the development. Meanwhile, the financial house of cards began collapsing. Insurance companies withdrew coverage based on the fraudulent applications. Banks called in loans. Homeowners, many of whom had been unaware of the corruption, began filing lawsuits of their own. Richard Thornwell was arrested at City Hall, charged with corruption, fraud, and environmental crimes. His face, pale and stunned, filled the news. Screens right beside the images of water flowing where it belonged. Maggie was taken in for questioning. Her perfect composure finally shattered. She tried to blame everyone, her husband, the contractors, even me, but the evidence was overwhelming. Emails, documents, recordings. They'd been so confident they'd never get caught that they'd barely bothered to hide their crimes. As dawn broke, the rain eased, and the water settled into its renewed path. The damage was revealing, not to property, but to pretenses. The HOA's carefully constructed lies were laid bare by the simple truth of water following gravity. I walked down to where the creek now flowed, through what had been their sales office. Federal agents had set up a perimeter, but they let me through. I was, after all, the reason they were here. The water was clear and clean, already scouring away the artificial changes. Small fish from our reservoir were exploring the new old territory. Birds were returning. The air smelled right again, like water and earth and renewal. A reporter approached me, her microphone held like a weapon. "Are you satisfied?" she asked. I looked at the water, at the way it moved with such confident memory. "This wasn't about satisfaction," I said. "It was about truth. And water always tells the truth." In the distance, I saw Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Gable and the other downstream farmers. They were standing at the edge of the restored creek, their faces showing something I hadn't seen in years. Hope. They knew what this meant. The water remembered them too. The federal EPA director approached me, her hand extended. "You've provided an invaluable service," she said formally, then smiled. Also, that was the most beautiful compliance demonstration I've ever witnessed. As the sun broke through the clouds, catching the water in streaks of gold, I realized it was over. Not just my fight, but the whole corrupt system they'd built. The water had done what courts and lawyers couldn't. It had shown the truth in a way nobody could deny. And truth, like water, eventually wins. In the end, the water settled exactly where it had always belonged, in the historical creek bed that now meandered through the failed development like a blue ribbon through spoiled finery. The McMansions stood empty and unsold, their foundations slightly damp. Their waterfront claims now legally accurate but commercially worthless. The Thornwells pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges, racketeering, fraud, environmental crimes, and received sentences that would keep them behind bars longer than the dam had stood. Their corrupt network unraveled completely, taking down 2 city council members, a judge, and several developers across the region. My property rights were restored completely, with additional protections granted due to the historical significance of the water rights. The dam received federal designation as a historical infrastructure site, ensuring its protection in perpetuity. The downstream farmers got their water back, their farms reviving within a single growing season. Mr. Henderson personally delivered the first harvest of sweet corn to my doorstep, a tradition that continued every summer thereafter. The development itself became something different, a conservation area managed by a trust that included representation from all the downstream landowners. The failed McMansions were dismantled, the land restored to native grasses and wildflowers. The creek, now permanently protected, became a haven for wildlife and a living lesson in the futility of fighting nature. I still live in my grandfather's house, still tend the land, still watch the water. Some mornings I walk down to the creek and simply listen to its sound, the same sound my great-grandfather heard, my grandfather heard, and now I hear. It's the sound of memory, the sound of truth, the sound of something that outlasts greed and corruption. The HOA is gone, but the water remains. And every time it rains, I smile a little, remembering that sometimes the best justice is the kind that flows naturally. They thought they could control the water, control the land, control the law. But they learned the same lesson everyone eventually learns. You can damn the truth, but you can't stop it. Eventually, the water always wins.